then to your far right is Greg Renstrom. Greg was a classmate of mine at McAllister. I was a classmate of his. He's a lot brighter than I am at McAllister College, and it was a great 4 years that we had. Greg served Presbyterian and Methodist churches in Michigan and in Minnesota, and is one of the pastors that's acknowledged in Kent's Ordinary Grace as being a reader and a consultant to him. So we're here to talk a little bit about grace, both ordinary and extraordinary. We've got a sort of a little bit of an outline. And the first question that I have is sort of a simple one, and Greg alluded to it in his message for those of you that heard it. But what is grace? And I think it was Philip Yancey who gave me a definition that I like that distinguishes between mercy and grace. And he says the following, that mercy is not receiving something that we deserve, and grace is receiving something that we don't deserve. So there's a difference between mercy and grace. So I'd like to ask the two of you, in whatever order you'd like to go, what's a simple, if there is, a simple definition of grace?
Didn't you study this at seminary? I thought you did a pretty good job this morning. If you would just sort of reiterate what you said about grace.
I seem to be the problem here. During worship, we talked about grace being the love of God in action. Love of God in action. We all know that love is a supremely important experience. Grace puts it into practice, in things that we can see and touch and take in. The love is I would define it as the love of God in action.
Yeah, that was pretty succinct. I have a few more words. When I talk about grace, it's so weird. I gotta tell you, it's so weird. So I'm a storyteller. That's really what I just tell stories. So I write Ordinary Grace, and all of a sudden I'm supposed to talk about these really deep theological things. Because really, with Ordinary Grace, I just wanted to tell a really good, compelling story. And along the way, it happened to touch on issues that as I wrote the story, I realized were important to me, and grace is one of those. When I talk about grace, I talk about it in two different ways. I talk about grace as a thing, and I often use it interchangeably with the word blessing. So we offer graces to one another. We offer the blessings. Do you know, before meals, we say grace, we say blessing. So they're sort of interchangeable that way. But I also think of grace as a state, and it's that state in which we exist. And we exist without deserving it. We exist in this state oftentimes without being aware of it, which is one of the reasons I love coming to church. I love being in a place that reminds me I'm in a state of grace. Through no action of my own, I'm in a state of grace. So grace is that loving gift of God, that loving, all-encompassing, across the board forgiveness of everything that I am.
Great responses. So in an interview, Philip Yancey, in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, grace is a pretty popular title, as you might guess, in theological writings, he says the following quote, "We, Jesus followers, need to go out into the world and get our hands dirty. And if we do, we will see a world thirsty for grace." How would you respond to his comments? We will see a world thirsty for grace. Do you sense that in your retirement? Do you sense that in your travels and in your conversations with people literally around the United States?
Yeah.
You can see the difference between a pastor and a writer. to sort of get right to it, don't they?
You know, I had the really great good fortune of hearing Annie Lamott speak about a year ago. For those of you who don't know Annie Lamott, she's really a great inspiration for those of us who are writers. And she's just a great inspiration for people in general. And in her remarks to us, she talked about the fact that we are all broken people. She said we're all broken and we're all pre-approved. And I guess that's the sense that I have of everyone. We all have this sense of brokenness. And I think what we need is that sense that in addition, we're all pre-approved, and that's the grace.
I like that. Greg, you want to add anything to that?
No.
Can you guys sing? Max Lucado, another very well-known Christian writer, says this: grace is not something you believe in. Grace comes after you in ordinary ways and in extraordinary ways. Have you experienced grace coming after you in ordinary or extraordinary ways?
I'm not an expert on other religions of the world, so I can't say for sure whether this is true of other religions or not. But Christianity is very clearly a religion that emphasizes at least two things that I think have bearing on grace. One is that we are, this is a theological, long-term, incarnational. That we believe that God put God's love into flesh. That was the first reading that was read this morning. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. We are an incarnational religion. We are also a relational religion. Christianity is not a philosophy, it's not an ethic. It has philosophy and it has ethics, but at the heart of Christianity is a relationship. And at the heart of Christianity is our love for Jesus and Jesus' love for us. And as followers of Jesus, we have only one job, and that's to follow Jesus. And so when I think of experiences of grace, they're usually incarnational, and they're usually relational.
You want to unpack that word incarnational, because that's sort of a...
I alluded to...
I think that's a seminary word and not a literary word.
It's a $12 word. I haven't used it in 35 years. I alluded to this at the first service, but I carry around in my pocket two little symbols. And I will take back many wonderful things from Southminster Presbyterian Church. One of the things I will take back from Southminster Presbyterian Church is that I met today a shirt-tail relative of Susan B. Anthony. She's here today. A gift. Because I mentioned Susan B. Anthony as being just a saint from the 19th century. But the other thing I carry around in my pocket right now is a 35-year medallion from AA. For a long time, life was awful. And then suddenly, life became wonderful. And what's the difference? I choose to believe it's incarnational. The grace of the Lord working in very specific, very concrete, very visible ways. And every day I look in the mirror and I'm still sober. 35 years later, that's grace. And we have our part to play in it. We're not passive. We don't sit back and relax and say, grace me. But we're secondary participants. And that's the incarnational bit. Seeing it in things that are a part of our experience.
And being able to see grace and affirm grace in other people, I think, is a gift that God has given the potential that God has given to all of us. And we live in a world that is far too critical of each other and far unto loving and affirming of each other. And if nothing else, I think ordinary and extraordinary grace reminds us that we all fall short, don't we? Well, two of us, I don't know.
We all fall far short than others.
And that grace is that unmerited affirmation of God, that each of us is not only worth something to God, but we're worth something to each other. And our faith is based upon a God that pursues us, whether we want to be found or not. We're all prodigals in one way or another, I think. Did you want to respond to the differentiation between ordinary and extraordinary grace at all?
Yeah, for those of you who know the story, Ordinary Grace in the book. When I began to write that book, the title was not Ordinary Grace, it was Awful Grace, which comes from that great Aeschylus quote that's important to the story. He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. So I began, the working title for the manuscript was Awful Grace. I knew it was a terrible title, but it gave me something to work with. And the more I wrote that story, the more I saw that really what I was talking about were the ordinary blessings, the ordinary graces that we offer one another every day, through our forgiveness, through our acceptance. And then when that title came to me, Ordinary Grace, I knew there was going to be a moment in the story in which ordinary grace would take on a very specific and magnificent meaning. And so, in that ordinary grace that Jake delivers unstuttering at the funeral meal, an extraordinary grace is delivered. It's a miracle. I think we all experience that. We experience the ordinary graces, the ordinary blessings, and we don't even think about them. But I think every one of us, if we thought about our lives, could think about a moment that we all think of as an extraordinary grace. We received nothing short of a miracle. I think everybody I'm guessing everybody in your life, if you given a moment, could think about that. Yeah. And then there's, of course, that overarching, at one point in the story, Frank's father, Nathan Drum, who's the Methodist minister, talks to his son about that term, awful grace. And he says, it's not awful in a terrible way. It's awful in that it's so enormous and so mysterious and so wonderful that we'll never really be able to comprehend it. And that's that overwhelming grace that surrounds us all the time.
Yeah, I agree. When in the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures, you sometimes hear the phrase, our awful God. What that really means is our awesome God. The big God of grace that's out there that has a bigger plan for all creation and individual creation like you and me. So we talked last night we had this wonderful dinner, this Valentine's dinner together, and we talked about titles of Kent's books and how he got to the titles. He's gonna talk more about that this afternoon. But one of the questions I have for you, Kent, is you write all these Cork O'Connor mysteries. How many of you have read at least one of his mysteries? By the way, there's going to be a book signing this afternoon, and we have several of those mysteries for you to purchase there. The three of us particularly absolutely love these because they have all the truth of Minnesota in them.
In all its awful graces.
Yeah. That would be awful winters. But you write all these mystery novels, which I totally enjoyed reading. But suddenly, out pops a different book, Ordinary Grace. Can you just give us a little bit of was this a nudge by God that created this sort of blip in your writing path, or had you been brooding on this for a while? Or Can you say something about that?
Sure, but Mary Kay,
Yes.
is this something we're going to touch on later?
Sort of.
Yeah, but not everybody will be here later, so.
So go ahead, I've got sort of a different slant on it.
Okay.
It's that kind of question I said I was going to talk about.
Okay. I just didn't want to tip my hand too early. Yeah, for those of you who know the Corporal Connor, anybody who's, okay, so quick background, Corporal Connor. For those of you who haven't read the series, Corporal Connor, I set my books, that series up in the Great North Woods of Minnesota. Just north of Ely, or just north of Duluth,
Yeah.
really, your hometown.
That's where God lives, right?
There you go. or at least it's next door to where God is. And my protagonist, Corporal Connor, is a man of mixed heritage. He's part Irish-American and he's part Ojibwe. So he's a guy with a foot in two different spiritual traditions, his white Catholicism, his Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. And often in those stories, he's trying to figure out where his own individual spiritual path lies. And that's really been an issue for me much of my life. And several years ago then I had a story idea come to me that wasn't the Corporal Connor story, but that when I thought about it, I thought, this is the vehicle that will allow me to explore more deeply the whole question of the divine in our lives, our spiritual journeys. And I'll probably talk about this later. Writing that book was a very risky proposition in my career, because a long time ago my publisher sat me down and said to me, Kent, we only want Corporal Connor novels from you. So I knew if I wrote this book it was going to be at great risk, but I simply couldn't turn away from it. I was compelled to write it.
God was pursuing you.
Well, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
And you responded and said yes. Just a little whisper, there's a sequel coming to Ordinary. He's going to talk about it.
We'll talk about that later.
Talk about that later. So you got to come back at 3 o'clock to get that part of the...
This is the suspense we talk about in the
Yes,
storytelling.
yes. You always want to leave suspense in sermons and books and all those kind. And Greg and I are good at leaving suspense, right? Any other comments that you want to make about grace, either ordinary or extraordinary? And we're going to take a moment to have any of you that would like to ask a question, not about the books, but about grace, ordinary grace. We can talk about. The rest of the books we're going to talk about this afternoon. So be thinking of a question you might have. Any other?
We both happen to be United Methodists. We were associated for 11 years in the same congregation. One of the things that's unique and distinctive about the United Methodist Church is that we're methodical. That's about the only thing that separates us from anybody else. We're methodical. And for me that's important, because that means if you look for grace, you'll find it. If you don't look for grace, you may still trip over it. Or it will catch you in a way that can't be missed. But generally speaking, if you have your eyes open to the possibility that there is this incredible thing at work in our lives, you'll see it and feel it. And can you imagine, I don't want to embarrass you, I used to do. Can you imagine what it would mean for a minister to look out into the 9th pew of a church every Sunday and see Kent Krueger and have him be your writing coach? A gift. We talked about you mentioned this, about suspending or drawing people in with a sense of a mystery, 2 mysteries. These are the kinds of things that Kent was able to teach. And to me, if you have your eyes open to that possibility, thank goodness you'll see it. If you don't, you might miss it.
Is envy one of the 7 deadly sins? If so, I'm envious of your opportunity to look out on the 9th.
You know, I just got to say this too. For a long time, my wife and I did not attend church. We both sort of thought we'd we were putting our spiritual journeys behind us. And when we went in search of a church, when we knew we really wanted to become a part of all of us who are on that journey together, we began visiting churches. And oh heck, we could just as easily have ended up Presbyterians.
But it wasn't predestined.
But we happened to attend Hamlin, and we heard Greg preach, and he just captured us, his spirit. You saw the energy of Greg this morning when he was preaching to you. There were times when he was preaching from the pulpit in Hamlin Church when I really thought he was going to throw himself out of the pulpit. He was so excited, so enthusiastic. And it was so common to go to church and to hear a sermon that Greg offered us that spoke so deeply to an issue I was struggling with, that it wasn't an uncommon thing for me to leave church with tears in my eyes, because he had helped me come to grips with something that I was just struggling with very deeply. So, you talk about grace as ordinary and extraordinary. I think those of us who've had the pleasure of having Greg lead us spiritually know what an extraordinary grace he's been in our lives.
People cry when I preach too, but for a different reason. One of my favorite quotes from Max Lucado is the following: "Grace is God's best idea, to ravage people with love, to rescue people passionately, and to restore people with justice." And I just think that is an awesome quote for us to think about grace, both ordinary and extraordinary. Any questions related to grace, ordinary or extraordinary, from those of, yes, Keith?
Well, there's another.
You gotta stand and ask it loud.
Oh, okay. Of course, being a musician, there's another meaning of ordinary that I don't know if it would figure in at all, but it makes me curious, because our brethren in the Catholic Church, as well as Anglican, Lutheran, there are two essential components to the musical liturgy. You have the ordinary and you have the propers. The ordinary is methodical. It repeats. It's always there, in a way, because it's the Agnus Dei, the Kyrie, those components are repeated. They're part of just the repetitive rite. The propers are like the sung scriptures and so forth that vary through the rite, and they change every week. And it's just an interesting that we're here in a churchly setting, and the word ordinary can actually have a different meaning, but I wonder if there might be a metaphor there as well.
I'll make a quick response to that. We belong to the same liturgical family, the mainline denominations, and there's liturgical time that goes through the whole year, and there's holy time or special time, extraordinary time, which we would call Lent and Advent and Christmas and Easter, and then the rest of the time is referred to as ordinary time, in which ordinary grace is experienced. So my guess in part is that the music parallels that to some degree, but you two have any additional comments?
We're not from a particularly liturgical tradition. I appreciate the distinction that is made liturgically and musically.
I guess one of the main things that came to my mind, though, that fit in with everything you're saying, is that just because it's ordinary does not mean that it isn't special.
Thank you. It's a great distinction made.
Nice point. Other questions, comments? How about way in the back? Is that Jean?
Yes.
Can you stand, please?
We've been studying meeting spirit in our Bible study group, and I was wondering how you connect your experiences of grace with the experience of the Holy Spirit working in your life. Does
question is if and how does the Holy Spirit connect with our experience of grace? Is that accurate?
Because we've been studying how he leads us and he energizes us. We've been talking about energy. And in our studies, it all equates with the Holy Spirit. So I was just curious as to how you see that.
Okay. Oh, were you gonna jump in there, Greg?
Go ahead.
You know, again, I have to be really honest with you. I didn't really necessarily think deeply about all of these issues until Ordinary Grace came out and it began to talk to people about what Ordinary Grace meant to them, has meant to them. And so I've received notes from people and met people who have recently lost a loved one, someone very dear, and the grieving process was difficult for them. And they've told me that in reading Ordinary Grace, they found comfort. And so I've begun to think, okay, so here I am, this regular guy. I put my pants on one leg at a time every morning. Sometimes forget to brush my teeth. And yet here's something that I've produced, had a hand in creating, that means so much more than I ever thought it was going to mean to people. And so I think, okay, somehow something has operated through me. I had the sense so often as I was writing Ordinary Grace that something was channeling through me. This was so much beyond what I thought I was maybe capable of creating on my own. And the other thing then that I've begun to realize in thinking about this now is that I think we all tap into, become part of the flow of the Divine Spirit. Because every time we open our arms to someone in acceptance or forgiveness, we're like vessels. We're like the water mains. We're like what channels that grace of God among all of us. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. It says, Kent, that the Holy Spirit, it was and is working through you. And it reminds me of the very last couple sentences in the epilogue that you wrote, if you don't mind me reading it, talking about the parting words of Warren Redstone, which I understand now, the dead are never far from us. They're in our hearts and on our minds, and in the end, all that separates us from them is a single breath, one final puff of air, which might mean why somebody could read this book and feel connected to a loved one. Nicely written. Greg, did you want to respond to that at all?
Well, I appreciate the question. I think different people resonate with different facets of God's activity in the world. For some people, the Holy Spirit is at work in ways that they can touch. One of the things we're going to be talking about at the 11 o'clock hour is that after 40 years of pastoral ministry, and it occurred some time ago, so it's less than 40 years ago, the friendship of Jesus became that which I talked about, lived with. So that the effect was the same, though we might consider the reflections of it different. Does that make sense? Thank you.
How about one more? Yes. Tell us who you are.
I'm Barb.
Oh, I know who you are. Can you stand up and ask me this?
And I hope it's an appropriate question for this hour and not the 3 o'clock hour. But as you speak of grace in this religious context, and I think of your character, the Middy, in your books, your Corporal Connor books, I guess I'm curious from you if there's a concept similar to grace in the Ojibwe tradition, and if there's a concept similar to grace in other belief systems that are perhaps non-Christian. Does that an appropriate question?
Sure, that's a good question, and she's referring to the character Henry Malou, who appears in, I think, all of your Cork O'Connor books. So do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, you know, I honestly can't say that I have enough knowledge to say, yes, there is that concept of grace. But what I will say is this, that in the Native tradition, spiritually, there is an understanding that we live in a world that is immersed in the Spirit. There is nothing around us that does not contain Spirit. A dead tree contains Spirit. The animal that you kill for your sustenance contains Spirit. And so you are always talking to everything around you. You're in conversation with everything around you because you are all connected by that great Spirit. And they talk about the Great Spirit. Their name for it is Kitchi-Manadu, which means great Spirit, or often it's more poetically translated as the Great Mystery. And in traditional Native, their way of living, they are always aware of and immersed in that knowledge of the Spirit and their connectedness with all of it. Grace itself, well, shoot, wouldn't that come naturally? Sort of out of that.
Thank you. You know, God is a great mystery, and in our Christian tradition, what helps us unpack that mystery is that God sent Jesus to embody what that reality is all about. So I think that's a starting point for us to think about the embodiment of grace in the life and ministry of Jesus. Well, how fun is this? We could go on for another 8 seconds. But we need to transition to worship upstairs and give Greg a chance to catch his breath. We invite you upstairs for those of you who would like for our contemporary worship time. We invite all of you back at 3 o'clock. We'll be upstairs and we'll continue conversations similar to this, but focus more on the art of writing and things like that. And Mary Kay Walsh, yes.
Well, we invite back at 2:30 to buy books.
Right, 2:30 for the
Booksellers will be
book
there.
signing and for the purchasing of some of Kent's great books. So thanks for being here. This was
Thanks,
a lot
folks.
of fun.